So in this video, I would like to discuss the things you must know before learning Russian. Before approaching the subject matter, there are a few things I would like to say as to how I will be teaching Russian and how I will engage in the context of this complicated language. I'm going to be teaching and explaining things very differently because Russian is a language that requires more attention and a slow explanation of every concept that it has. Before jumping into the basic grammatical concepts, there are many things that you have to know about it so that later, the context of Russian will make more sense. At first, as many of you can tell by the banner of my YouTube channel, I am a native Russian speaker. Educating somebody about Russian can be complicated, but I do have a plan to make things very simple for everybody. As a native Russian speaker, this means that I will be going very slowly, not stuttering, and explaining every concept in Russian slowly, surely, and simply. This also means that I will not be making mistakes when demonstrating basic Russian concepts, and it's something that I did not do when doing my long Spanish video about every concept you need. Once again, I'm a native Russian speaker, so in the context of Russian, I do know what I'll be talking about. Secondly, I would like to specify the difference between the ways of educating that I used in Spanish versus the ways that I'll be using now. Before immediately diving into Russian concepts, there are many things that you simply have to know in Russian. I am not talking about Russian grammar, but simply Russian rules that will be applied once you start to learn Russian grammar. In my Spanish videos, explaining Spanish concepts was easy because Spanish and English grammar are very similar, so it was possible to dive into Spanish grammar right away. That is not the case with Russian. As a native Russian speaker, I am putting myself in the shoes of the people who only speak English, or at least use English as a primary language to learn other languages. Because my content is fit for people who only have English as their native language, it's only fair if I put myself in their position. I'm not expecting everybody to understand the concepts right away, but it is significant to understand how everybody learns. If you're watching this video and your native language is English, meaning that you're using English to learn other languages, then this video will make perfect sense to you. If you speak any other language and still know English as a second or third, then this video will still be very educational. And that's something very crucial to emphasize. Learning Russian using English. Even though I don't recommend doing it, many people just know English as their native language, and so they have to use English as their only source. As I said again, I'm putting myself in the position of those who only speak English or those who use English as a placeholder, so therefore, I will be explaining Russian concepts using English as easily as I can. Before actually learning Russian grammar, that is past, present, future tenses, verb conjugations, all of these things, there are things that you simply have to know in Russian because these are the foundational rules of Russian. In the beginning, you don't necessarily have to understand these things, you just have to follow these rules in Russian. And I will explain them as easily as possible, considering that I will be teaching Russian using English. So let's get into it. The first thing you should know about Russian is the difference between literal and spoken Russian. Literal Russian is the Russian you see on paper, and it's the Russian that most people use to learn Russian grammatical ideas. You can find this Russian in books, subtitles, magazines, and anything else that has literacy. Spoken Russian, on the other hand, is self-explanatory. It's the Russian that is used in conversations. However, spoken Russian is completely different than literal Russian, meaning Russian that you learn on paper will sound completely different when you start listening to it, especially through Russian natives. For instance, when engaging in a Russian conversation, 90% of words that have the letter O will be pronounced with the letter A. Let's take the word computer in Russian. For now, don't worry about any of the letters. I will explain them later. When looking at this word in Russian, we can pronounce it as kom-pyu-ter. Kom-pyu-ter. However, for a native Russian speaker, the word is pronounced computer. Computer. This is the difference in dialect between literal and spoken Russian. Now, the reason I've brought this up is to give you a different perspective on the dialects that exist within complicated languages like Russian. Back when I was doing my Spanish videos, I immediately jumped into Spanish grammar because Spanish doesn't require specific explanations of the rules it has. Literal Spanish and spoken Spanish are basically the same, meaning the Spanish you listen to will be pronounced the same as it's on paper. And it's the same thing with English, aside from distinctive pronunciations within different accents. This type of dialect is very different in Russian, especially when it's spoken. As a native Russian speaker, I will pronounce every Russian word and sentence both ways so you can understand the difference between literal and spoken Russian, because the whole point of learning Russian is to speak it. The second thing to know about Russian is the difference between typed and written Russian. In other words, it's the difference between how Russian is printed and how Russian is written on paper. Now, in the first point, I already explained Russian on paper, but I would like to specify a few more things. Printed Russian utilizes its printed alphabet and puts more emphasis on letter spacing and expressions. This is the type of Russian that I will use in every video of Russian fundamentals. Written Russian is also known as cursive Russian written on paper, and is the Russian that natives use to write. I will not be explaining cursive Russian whatsoever because I personally cannot even read or write it, but mainly because it's only used for writing. In the videos that I will do about Russian, I will focus on printed Russian only, but if you're interested in cursive Russian, I have a link in the description that explains Cyrillic cursive Russian on a separate site. The third thing you should know is that Russian has no definite or indefinite articles, considering again that I'm explaining Russian using English. The reason Russian doesn't have articles can be explained using two things. Russian has declensions, which I will explain later in the video, and Russian relies on context. Context is more significant because it is almost always clear whether we speak about a definite or indefinite concept. Sometimes it's unclear, so we use additional words to justify that. From a Russian standpoint, the concept of articles is redundant because articles do not carry any additional information that is not visible from the context. Take a look at this text. I go to store, I enter store and walk in aisle. In aisle, I find book and buy book. When I pay for it, I see man. I give man money and he gives me receipt. I go back home and read book. As native English speakers, we can correctly and instinctively place all the missing articles in the text because once again, we use additional words to justify the definiteness or indefiniteness of nouns. Russian, however, doesn't have this concept because it relies just on context, without having definiteness or indefiniteness of nouns. If you're trying to learn or think in Russian, simply remove all articles from your mind because this is a concept you need to know before learning Russian. The fourth thing you should know is that Russian has no sense of progression, whether it's in the past, present, or future. What I mean by that is the English fundamental of INGs at the end of participles and placing the verb to be before each progressive action. In English, we can say, I am eating, he is sleeping, you are speaking, she was seeing, we were talking, and I will be showing. One concept that these sentences share is the ing at the end of the participle, along with am, is, are, was, and were, which are conjugations of the verb to be. In English, this concept is called the continuous, also known as the past, present, or future progressive. This type of tense, just like with articles, doesn't exist in Russian. The reason why is because of a grammatical difference, but mainly because Russian participles fulfill the work of adjectives only. What I mean by that is that Russian does have the meaning of the continuous or progressive, but it does not have a tense for it. Because English participles have more verbal characteristics than adjectives, English participles have been developed into continuous ones. Russian participles only fulfill the work of adjectives, which doesn't make a continuous. Try to think of it as a concept that is more explicit in English than in Russian, because participles have the meaning of the continuous in both languages, but only English has a tense. This leads me to the fifth thing you should know, and that is, Russian has no perfect tenses. The perfect tense also doesn't exist in Russian, just like the continuous. In English, the perfect tenses can be explained using to have, to had, to will have, or to could have, plus a participle ending in ed. Russian again has the meaning of the participles, which is used differently, but it does not have tenses. So overall, the perfect and continuous tenses cannot be in Russian because they don't exist in Russian. Additionally, the same thing could be said about the verb to be in the present tense, which leads me to the sixth thing you should know, and that is, Russian does have the verb to be, but it is not used in the present. What I mean by that is whenever it comes down to expressions relating to adjectives like I am tall, you are young, or he is happy, the conjugations of to be in the present, that is, am, is, and are, will not be used in the present in Russian. To be more specific, Russian does have the verb to be that is used in the past and future, but it is not used in the present. The reason why is because at some point in time, the conjugated personal pronouns I am, you are, or he is converged into one form and began to be removed. Because the language couldn't make use of it at the time, the purpose of using it was lost. So in modern times, Russian doesn't use to be in the present, but in the olden times, it was used at some point. In general, if you're saying a Russian sentence in the present, simply remember to not use the verb to be, to not use a progressive or perfect tense, and to not use articles because Russian doesn't have them. The seventh thing you should know is that Russian only has three simple tenses of time: the past, present, and future. Unlike English having continuous and perfect tenses, Russian only has three: the past, present, and future. However, it does not mean that Russian only has three aspects of these tenses. For instance, the past and future tenses have perfective and imperfective variations. The perfective is an action that was or will be completed, but the imperfective is an ongoing or habitual action. In English, try to think of the perfective as the past or simple future. Unfortunately, there is no English equivalent to the imperfective, and that is something I'll explain in future videos. Alongside, the usage of the two aspects can change the endings of verbs depending on the speaker, style of speech, and context. In future videos, I will explain each concept individually, but for now, simply put, Russian has three tenses with two aspects of the past and future. To understand which aspect to use, reading and listening might be the best methods because it feels very unnatural for people who only speak English. Of course, it is something that you have to get a feel for once you understand the tenses, which leads me to the eighth thing you should know, and that is, Russian nouns are gendered with the masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. The masculine and feminine genders are self-explanatory, but the neuter gender is something that not a lot of people know. In English, there is no gender when it comes down to nouns, but in Russian, there are three grammatical genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter. The neuter can be explained as the gender that is neither masculine nor feminine. It is simply neutral, and to distinguish if a noun is masculine, feminine, or neuter is something that I'll explain in a future video. The ninth thing you should know is that Russian has a devocalization of consonants. Now, to understand this concept, I would have to introduce and explain the Russian alphabet, which I will not do in this video because there are a lot of things you need to know about it. Instead, I will show just a few letters that explain this concept, and in the next video, I will elaborate more on the alphabet and its letters. In Russian, there are hard consonants and soft consonants. These consonants can become voiceless in some situations and sound more like their counterparts, which makes a big difference in the meaning of Russian words. In English, this can be shown as be, which sounds like pe, fe, which sounds like ve, se, which sounds like ze, and so on. Even though it's not a big deal in English, some Russian consonants will be pronounced differently or devocalized when put with vowels, which makes for different words. For instance, let's take the word cabin in Russian. Once again, don't worry about the letters for now. When looking at this word in Russian, we can pronounce it as budka. Budka. Even though there's the letter d in the middle, it precedes the letter k, and therefore it generates a t sound. Budka. This leads me to the 10th thing you should know, and that is, Russian has vowel reduction. Just like with consonants, Russian has vowels that get reduced when pronounced, meaning that they sound different from their alphabetical sound when put with hard or soft consonants, which makes a long sound. For instance, Russian has the vowels a, o, u, u, and e, which indicate that the preceding consonant is hard. On the other hand, there are the consonants ye, yo, i, u, and ya that indicate that the preceding consonant is soft. If you're interested in learning more about this, I have a link in the description explaining this concept on a different site. Still, I'll explain this concept more when I'll talk about the alphabet in the next video. The 11th thing you should know is that Russian has stress on syllables. Stress on syllables means that a word can change its meaning based on a stronger and longer sound. In languages like Spanish, it's possible to perceive this idea using accents, but in Russian, there are no rules indicating stress, so the only way to know how to say words is to listen to the pronunciation. For instance, Russian has this word, zamok. Zamok. For a native speaker, the word is pronounced zamak. Zamak. This word means castle. However, if we put the stress on the second syllable, the word will be zamok. Zamok. This word, zamok, now means lock, as in a lock on a door. This is stress in Russian. The 12th thing you should know is that Russian has a flexible sentence structure. The usual structure in English is subject-verb-object, or SVO. In Russian, it is possible to change the order of the words without changing the meaning too much, but a bit of context can still change the meaning. For instance, SVO in Russian is a natural intonation, SOV emphasizes the object, and VOS is a declarative and poetic undertone. If you're interested in this concept, I have a link in the description explaining this on a different site. And on that website, there are the last two most important things that you should know about Russian before learning it. The second to last thing to know about Russian is that it has what's called declensions. A declension, by definition, is the modification of nouns, pronouns, or adjectives by which a grammatical case, number, and gender are identified. In Russian, there are 6 cases that are very important to understand because using these cases, it is possible to speak Russian correctly. Now, I personally wouldn't call these declensions cases, but rather 6 different types of expressions that generate 6 ways to modify nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. Simply put, Russian has 6 different types of expressions, with each expression generating a different way to modify a word. The expressions themselves define the way a word modifies its form when used in a different context, and there is a total of 6 different expressions. Now, I'm not going to explain all of these expressions in this video because there are so many of them, but in a future video, I'll explain these expressions very easily and slowly because they require so. In case you want to learn more about them, once again, I have a link in the description that leads to a useful website that has these cases. Now, there is a big reason why I'm referring to these Russian cases as expressions and not declensions. Russian uses the case or expression system by modifying words in 6 different ways, which ultimately replaces the system of having a strict word order like in English. As I said previously, the reason Russian allows sentences to be jumbled in any order is because Russian is a highly expressive language that relies on the meanings of words and sentences as opposed to having a definitive system like in English or Spanish. The last thing you should know about Russian is that Russian is an extremely expressive language that allows you to emphasize a point by changing the order of the words in any sentence and by changing the words themselves. This makes Russian one of the most flexible and most beautiful languages ever made because it relies on the meaning of sounds, words, and sentences combined. Russian linguistically is not concrete nor strict like English and Spanish, it is quite literally the opposite. This means that to express something in Russian, the emphasis needs to be put on intonation, on how you say and not what you say. Languages like English and Spanish require a preliminary knowledge of the phonological conventions that exist, emphasizing what you say as opposed to how. In Russian, there are plenty of phonetic rules which explains why it relies on expressions, emotions, and even sometimes sounds. These types of Russian linguistics completely don't exist in almost any other language like French, German, Italian, Polish, Chinese, Greek, etc. This is the reason why I would call the 6 Russian cases the 6 Russian expressions, because Russian is a flexibly expressive language that is almost one of a kind. Just to recap on the things to know before learning Russian, every single point that I made throughout the video can be related to the last one because Russian is a highly expressive language. It is no wonder that there is a big difference between literal and spoken Russian, because when you speak Russian, you can express yourself in any way which doesn't exist in other languages. It is no wonder that Russian doesn't have articles, progressive, and perfect tenses because it doesn't need any additional words to be expressed. It is no wonder why Russian only has 3 simple tenses of time because there is no need to express yourself differently than the 3 existing tenses of time. It is no wonder why Russian has a variety of sounds, such as devocalization, reduction, and stress, because once again, you get to change your way of speech and how you say what you say so that it feels more emotional and expressive. It is no wonder why Russian has a flexible sentence structure, because you get to express yourself in any way you want. If you were to have a system that limits you to only one type of speech, then you wouldn't be able to express yourself differently. By changing the order of the words in a sentence, you're not just changing the order, you're also changing the meaning and how you express yourself. That's why in Russian, you can say a sentence in any way you want. It is no wonder why Russian has declensions, or the 6 Russian cases, because you get to modify not just your speech, but also the words themselves, which ultimately explains why Russian is a highly meaningful language that originated and relies on expressions. For instance, you can say the word cat in Russian, which would be koshka. That's how you pronounce it. Koshka. The way that this word originated was from a hand movement and sound that ancient Slavic people made whenever they wanted to get rid of an animal, typically a cat, and the sound was ksh. Over time, this sound was played with and eventually evolved into the word koshka. And this just shows how expressive and sound-based Russian is. Even though this mostly relates to linguistics, it is still something to appreciate about Russian. These are the most important things to know before learning Russian. This is what makes Russian very simple, yet very complicated, very beautiful, and very fascinating. In the next videos about Russian, I'll explain each concept individually as simply as possible so that all of you can understand how Russian fully works. Because Russian is very expressive, don't try to understand it by translating everything, but simply try to understand it by listening to how it is used. And from there, basic Russian grammar will be very simple for you to understand.